Okay, it's about 1:15, and I think we probably ought to begin. Once again, of course, we are talking about some of the... You can't hear me? Is that better? Can you hear me now? Okay. Talking about some of the issues that are raised in Paul's letter to the churches in Galatia. As we previously indicated, the churches of Galatia were unique among Paul's converted churches. They were of Celtic origin, and they were in northern Turkey, and most likely had never been exposed to Judaism before they were exposed to the church of Antioch and Paul's mission. And so the Galatians were really quite unique among the people to whom Paul preached during his lifetime. They helped him, however, to fashion his theology, which, quite honestly, became the theology of the Christian church. And we're going to really talk about three of those, of the aspects of that theology this morning. I hope I get to the third one this morning. The first one is ecclesiology, and that is, what did Paul tell us about church? What is the theology of church in Paul? The second is a strange word. It's antinomianism or nomialism. It's spelled both ways in the literature. Basically, it means against the law. And it is really the basic focus of the letter to the churches in Galatia. And sets the stage for the third point, which I hope we'll get to this morning, which is justification by faith, which ties in with Paul's basic notion of redemptive theology. So we're going to start with ecclesiology, the theology of church. You'll remember that Paul was a devout, if you can use that word, an avid Pharisee. He, on more than one occasion, describes himself as a Pharisee among Pharisees, really at the top of his class. And if you think about that statement, and you think about the way the Pharisees are portrayed in the Gospels, particularly the Gospel of John, you have to ask yourself, how is it that Paul, a Pharisee, becomes really the father of modern Christianity? And I think it's an interesting concept, and one of the things I tried to convey in the very first class was that Paul experienced a call and a dramatic conversion experience early in his life, which changed his life. And then, as that conversion worked out in his life, he began to develop some of these theological concepts. So I'm going to start by trying to describe to you, for just a couple of moments, the kind of church that Paul was raised in. Of course, he was a Jew, and he was surrounded by Jews and considered himself to be a Jew among Jews of the tribe of Benjamin. So what did it mean to be a good Jew at the time of Paul's early life? Well, first of all, you memorized the Torah, particularly if you were a man. Men were expected to spend hours every day, 6 days a week, studying, talking about, and memorizing the Torah. It was their principal occupation. And this, of course, ties right into the notion of patriarchalism that characterized Judaism in the Second Temple Judaism, which is the temple we're talking about, the period at the time of Christ. At this time, most of the labor in the household was handled by women to free the men to study the Torah and to become learned in the Torah and to become good Jews. And so a good Jew, a righteous Jew, and that word righteous comes up over and over again in the literature, means very simply a person who knows the rules of the Torah and follows them all of the time, or to the greatest extent they possibly can. And so a good Jew is a righteous Jew who follows the Torah. Now, there was a wrinkle in that around the time of Christ, which was very interesting. And it makes many theologians believe that the word Pharisee, when it appears in the Christian Bible, in the Gospels, is really a code word. And it doesn't mean the Pharisees at all, because it's highly unlikely that Jesus and his friends would have criticized devout Jews. They believe that the word Pharisee is actually a code word for those Jews who collaborated with the Romans and moved themselves into positions of economic and political power in the Israeli colony of the Romans. And they couldn't refer to them directly because it would have been too dangerous at that time. And lo and behold, there are many theologians who will argue today that in fact, every time you see the word Pharisee in the New Testament, you should strike it out and put in the word Sadducee, an upper-class collaborator who dealt with the Romans on a regular basis. So, at any rate, we have a good Jew would have been, now a Pharisee would have considered himself to be a very top Jew, a very, very good Jew. There's been a lot of literature that's come out in the last 20 or 30 years suggesting very, very strong, I should say that for years and years and years, the only thing we really knew about the Pharisees came to us from a Jewish Roman historian by the name of Flavius Josephus. Some of you may have read one of the 4 books that he wrote in the first century about that. And he describes the Pharisees in some detail. And his book basically became the characterization of the Pharisees throughout until only the last 2 or 3 generations, when Judaic scholars, looking through some other rabbinical materials that they have found, have begun to think that maybe the Pharisees were closer to what today we would describe as Hasidic Jews. That is, people who are very, very devout Jews and pay attention to all of the rules, which is an interesting kind of a concept. And so, in addition to being students of the Torah and spending a lot of time memorizing it and trying to deal with the rules of the Torah, life was slow because living the rules of the Torah was not easy. The number of times a day that you had to do a ritual washing, the number of times, the kinds of foods that you could eat and how they were prepared, etc., meant that being a righteous Jew was a full-time job at that time. But there were other characterizations of Judaism at the time. The first, of course, and most obviously, is the notion of sacrifice. And of course, if we look at ancient religions, including Judaism, sacrifice is ubiquitous. The notion that we as human beings give back something to our Creator, to acknowledge that we are the created and he or she is the creator. And so we give back something of ourselves. The notion of sacrifice was well ingrained in the Judaic religion. And there were really only 2 places, however, where you did sacrifice. Unlike the pagan Roman religion of the time, where there were temples in every community, multiple temples, and you could sacrifice at any one of them that you felt you wanted to do at any given time, for a good Jew, you sacrificed at the temple in Jerusalem, the second temple built in Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity. Unfortunately, by the time of Christ, the notion of sacrifice in the temple had been thoroughly corrupted, and there are at least two stories that are recounted in the Christian Gospels of Jesus actually turning over the tables of the money changers and criticizing the way sacrifice is done in the temple. The notion of sacrifice, in fact, last week's gospel actually has Jesus condemning the notion of sacrifice within Judaism, which was an interesting idea at the time. At a minimum, we know that Jesus rejected the corrupt way that sacrifice was being practiced at that time. We don't know beyond that. There's no description in the Gospels that Jesus or his disciples ever sacrificed in the temple, which is an interesting concept. But it was an important concept for Jews, and it was the lifeblood of Jerusalem at that time. Jerusalem couldn't support itself economically. It was a city, and this is an agricultural era, and if you didn't have a garden, you didn't eat. Unless you were able somehow to buy food from someone outside of the city. And there weren't too many ways in the city to make money. And as a consequence, the Jews of Jerusalem were very, very heavily dependent upon the charity of the Jews living outside of Jerusalem. And one of the ways that charity was shown was that pilgrimages were made to Jerusalem to do a ritual sacrifice, typically 6 times a year if you were a good Jew. There were 6 principal sacrificial feasts. So you would move to Jerusalem and do a sacrifice, live in hostels along the way and in Jerusalem, and leave a charitable donation for the community while you were there. And these pilgrim feasts, like tourism, modern day tourism, became the lifeblood of Jerusalem and very important to its economy. And so there was really no liturgy as such, as we know it today, in Second Temple Judaism. There was sacrifice, there was study. Where did the study happen? Well, there's been a long debate among biblical theologians as to the prominence of the synagogue, the notion of a synagogue. For years, in fact, toward the time when I was studying this era, which was only like 13 or 14 years ago now, it was still being taught that the notion of synagogue was a 2nd century phenomenon in Judaism, and that there weren't synagogues at the time of Jesus. That's more or less, that theory has more or less been disproven right now. And there are quite literally hundreds of digs that have occurred in modern Israel demonstrating that synagogues did in fact exist. But in fact, it appears that these synagogues were more like what we would describe today as a caravanserai, a place where people who came to trade could trade their goods. It hosted markets. It had places where you could have your animals fed and cared for when you came in to trade. Long caravans that ran from the east toward the coast and Rome would stop. And these synagogues would turn out to be mini hotels for these caravans. But most of the synagogues had meeting rooms, and it is now believed that those meeting rooms became the places where these cohorts of would-be rabbis would gather every day to study the Torah. And so that was the way religion was practiced at the time of Christ. And so when Jesus was walking around Galilee and Judea, he was not seeing people going to church on Sunday morning as such. He wasn't seeing any kind of liturgical practice whatsoever. The closest, we think, that might have witnessed, something that was later adopted by Christianity, was the notion that the extended family gathered on the night before the Sabbath and held a ritual meal with ritual blessings on the family. That ritual meal was later adapted in the medieval times, in the 12th or 13th century, to what we would describe today as the Passover. And so the Passover meal that modern Judaism has does not date to the time of Christ. The Last Supper was not a Passover meal. It was more likely a Friday night meal of an extended family, which later developed into a quasi-Passover or Passover meal during medieval Judaism in Western Europe, and particularly in Germany and Poland. All right, let's contrast that to the way Paul's house churches worked. Because we know from his letters that by the time he had preached for 15 or 20 years, there were dozens, perhaps even 100 or more house churches who were some of them calling themselves Jewish Christians, some calling themselves Christians, but all clearly looking at a gathering together. So let's think about it. The first thing that happened, of course, was that because of the turmoil in Israel, the Romans had instituted rules that prohibited more than 3 men from gathering together in any one place after dark. As a consequence, setting up a house church and running it simultaneously with what would have been the patriarchal family meal of Judaism became an impossibility, because you just couldn't have gathered people together on the eve of the Sabbath for a liturgy. And therefore, it turns out that by the time of Paul, we know that Christians were gathering on the day after the Sabbath in the morning before they went to work, Sunday morning. And that by the middle of the 1st century, Christian Jews were beginning to gather for prayers on Sunday mornings, and they began to look upon those liturgies or those meetings as celebrations of the resurrection, which of course occurred on a Sunday in ancient times. And so we have this transition from the pre-Sabbath meal of Judaism to the Sunday morning prayer service of Christianity. As I said, most of these meetings were held in homes, and therefore on the Sabbath, which Christians also at that time celebrated, which would have been Saturday afternoon, we would say today, many Christians would gather for an early meal before dark. And they developed the notion of an agape meal, and ultimately that meal developed into a modeling after the Last Supper, Lord's Supper. And you'll remember that the Lord's Supper is described in 3 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. So we have 4 different descriptions of the Lord's Supper and the agape meal in the New Testament. Only John's Gospel, for some reason, and there are lots of theories about why, but John's Gospel omits the Last Supper in his description of the day before the Passion. And so the agape meal began to be celebrated, and it turns out that it became ritualized, and there were 2 ritualized meals. One seems to be based upon the description of the Last Supper in Matthew's Gospel. The other seems to be the one described in Luke's Gospel. And so there were 2 different agape motifs that came about at that time. And it appears to the principal difference between the 2 of them is, and it's the reverse of what you would expect. If Matthew's Gospel is to the Jews, and Luke's is to the Gentiles. You'd expect that Matthew's gospel would describe more accurately the Jewish pre-Sabbath meal. But it turns out that's not correct. That Luke's description is a more accurate description than Matthew's. But for some reason, therefore, Matthew's gospel description of the Last Supper became the way the agape meal was celebrated within Christianity in the northern part of the Roman Empire, from Israel north, and Luke's was celebrated in the south, in Egypt, and ultimately Ethiopia. And so there are, even today, within the Christian world, there are two forms of the Eucharist, one celebrated in the northern parts of Christianity and the other in North Africa. The agape meal was typically presided over by the owner of the house in which it took place. This is it's remarked several times in Paul's letters. It's been one of the principal arguments that theologians have used for the ordination of women, since it appeared that in the earliest church established by Paul, many of these house churches were owned by widows and wealthy widows who were also who were described by Paul by their first name in his letters. And as a consequence, it appears that the presider at many of these early liturgies was a woman. And that has become, as I said, one of the principal arguments used by feminist theologians for the ordination of women in really a level of argumentation which we've seen during our lifetimes. It seems that Paul's liturgies developed into a two-part liturgy, not unlike our own. During the first part of the liturgy, what we would describe today as a liturgy, what they would describe as a meeting at that time, they would pray, probably using the Psalms, maybe using the Old Testament. They would tell stories about the life of Jesus. Remember that when Paul is founding these churches, the Gospels don't exist. I mean, the Gospel of Mark, the first Gospel, probably doesn't see great prominence within the Christian world until the mid-50s. And the Gospels of Luke and Matthew don't appear until the 60s, and John's doesn't appear until quite late in the century. And so there wouldn't have been Gospel readings, but that doesn't mean that the stories associated with the life of Jesus were not told, because this was very, very much an oral civilization. People memorized stories. They paid people to memorize stories. People would come in and recite stories, sort of like the minstrels that we saw in the medieval time. And so it was quite likely that in these house churches, people would be deputized to tell stories about various aspects of the life of Jesus. And they probably would have read one or more of Paul's letters. Then they would have gone into a meal format and had an agape or love meal, not unlike our modern day Eucharist. And so the two-part liturgy that we celebrate today in most of Christianity is indeed very, very old, probably dating back to the middle of the first century. But it probably had no practice whatsoever during the life of Jesus or by Jesus himself, although it was very, very prominent within Paul's time. Paul was, as I've mentioned before, a very practical theologian, and as a consequence, he allowed a lot of diversity within the house churches. He allowed them to go their own way, so to speak, as long as they maintained the basic concepts of what he described as the law of love. And therefore, Paul's house churches are referred to as congregational. They are house church specific, and therefore very, very different one from the other. Typically, Paul would have come to a community like that. He would have taught them, perhaps for 4, 5, 6 weeks, maybe half a season. He might have left a helper, like Titus or Timothy, or any of the others that are described in his letter, to stay with the community for a while. The job of Paul and his helper would have been to raise up a group within the community who could carry on the notions, the ideas that Paul was preaching within that community after he left. Because Paul didn't stay very long in most of his churches. We think that, except for Corinth, he probably never stayed more than 4 to 6 weeks in any of the churches that he founded. And you have to ask yourself today, what would this community be like if we all came together and we heard somebody tell us about how we should live our lives and how we should act and how we should celebrate the life of Jesus for 6 weeks and then went away? How would that community work within itself thereafter? Certainly, we have to assume that the Holy Spirit was very, very active during that time in guiding the leaders of that community. But I think we also have to assume there was probably a fairly high level of diversity within those house churches. However, as you get toward the end of the chapter in Galatians, which deals with these issues, you find that Paul, although he recognizes that he has to customize religion for each community to which he preaches, he still has a basic notion. He has a very, very basic notion, which is a universal church, so to speak, which he refers to as the body of Christ. And of course, the notion of the body of Christ, which we hear in our own liturgy almost every Sunday, is a Pauline concept. That even though there are multiple churches within that body, the church itself consists of all of these parts. Now, interestingly enough, in the letter to the Corinthians, Paul makes it very, very clear what he's talking about. When he starts talking about fingers and hands and eyes and other parts of the body, what he's really referring to is the fact that there's great diversity within his churches, but the strength of the body comes from the diversity of all of those parts. Theologians now describe that notion as being unity in diversity, unity through basic belief, rather than unity through sameness, because we didn't have sameness in the earliest part of the church. I'm obviously not going to get through all 3 of these this morning, so I'm sorry. I want to talk just for a few minutes about the second concept of antinomialism or nomianism. It's a fancy word that basically means no laws, that Paul rejected the notion of law. Now, if you consider the fact that in the early part of his life, Paul, being a Pharisee, would have memorized the 600 plus rules of the Torah and tried to adhere to every single one of them, you can understand how wrenching a personal decision it would have been for Paul to later in his life reject the notion of those rules. Now, what exactly what did the Jews think about those rules? Okay, well, they thought really on 2 levels. The first level, which I think we're all pretty familiar with, is that by keeping the rules, by being righteous, we could save ourselves. We could move ourselves into heaven, into salvation. That's a notion which I think a lot of Christians today continue to hold. Paul rejects that notion, but it was a basic Jewish notion at the time. There was an overriding communal notion as well, however. And it's another one that we're quite familiar with even today. We hear it almost every day on the news from someone or other. And that is the notion that if enough of us don't follow the rules, God is going to be angry and something terrible is going to happen to us. And that was a basic notion within Judaism of the time. which is that if the majority of the Jews were not righteous and did not continue to worship Yahweh and only Yahweh as the one and only God, then terrible things would happen to the Jews. The Roman occupation of Israel was attributed to the fact that not enough Jews became righteous after the Babylonian captivity when they were returned to Israel. And starting about 100 years before the time of Christ, two other notions began to rise up within the Jewish intellectual community. The first of these was, of course, that a Messiah was coming to establish and save Israel. But the precondition to the Messiah coming was that most Jews had to be righteous, law-abiding. And so if I was righteous and you weren't, you were jeopardizing my future. So you can understand that notion, I think. The other, of course, was related to it, which was this apocalyptic notion of a new Jerusalem, that there would be a kingdom of God on earth that would be totally and completely righteous. And the only way to get there was if we all individually became righteous, so that our community became righteous or law-abiding. These were very, very powerful concepts. And you can understand how, when he rejected those, Paul must have had nightmares at night about what he was doing. But Paul had come to the conclusion that Jesus had been crucified, sacrificed himself to redeem humankind. And therefore, salvation comes not if we each of us is righteous, but if each of us says yes to the redemptive power of Jesus' crucifixion. Boy, you can understand that paradigm shift was just so severe within the Jewish community. I mean, it's absolutely mind-boggling when you think. Imagine being raised your whole life saying, you know, you can get to heaven if you do A and B and C and D and E for the rest of your life, and then you're in. And then suddenly, when you're in middle age or a little older, someone comes to you and convinces you that's not right. That's not the way you get there. You've wasted your life up to now. What do you've got to do? You've got to say yes to Jesus. And of course, to Paul, saying yes means conversion, deep inner conversion, accepting the law of love and everything that the law of love implies. And as a consequence, we begin to see that the Christian churches that Paul founds begin to live in communes, begin to take co-responsibility for each other. I mean, we see in the Acts of the Apostles already the notion of pooling funds, of caring for the sick within the community, of feeding widows and orphans, etc. So the communities begin to grow into many examples of the body of Christ, with each member of the community having a responsibility to the community. That grows out of the law of love. And so later, of course, we see by the time of Luther that notion has been corrupted by the church. The church has put it backwards, basically, and I really have just a few minutes to work to try to get across this concept. But essentially, where Paul tells us that if we say yes and we love and we're inner converted, we will naturally do these things. It'll just come automatically for us. The church sets that completely on its head by the Middle Ages and begins to look again almost the way the Jews looked at the Torah, and began to promulgate rules and requirements, and basically began to promise people salvation if they acted in certain ways. And of course, Martin Luther, among others, recognized this. The church was incredibly corrupt at that time. And the notions of justification by saying yes, as I've just described it, in Galatians essentially becomes the creed of Luther's Protestantism in the Middle Ages. And we see an enormous split during the Reformation between Roman Catholics on one side and almost all the Protestant churches on another. This notion of justification by faith rather than justification by following the rules. It appears that in Galatians, Paul really wasn't quite so explicit about that. What Paul was doing, basically, I think, was attempting to convince the Galatians that they didn't have to pay attention to the more burdensome rules of the Torah. And we talked about those before, the rules for adult circumcision, for dietary rules, sanitary rules, etc. And so, but Paul is basically making this point that he's arguing that the Torah doesn't matter to a Christian. Luther takes that the next step, and he basically compares the Torah practices of Paul's time to the corrupt practices of the Christian church at his time. And this notion of justification by faith comes into being and causes a massive split within Christian peoples in the 13th century. Okay, I have just about all I've got time for this morning. Next time we'll talk about the consequences that Paul begins to recognize. And that is that if people are freed of these rules and are taught to love and then act accordingly, where does that leave the community? Where do you get the signposts for a community to tell that community how to conduct its affairs? And Paul begins to recognize that some people are taking advantage of that. And he begins to circle back a little bit. So we'll talk about that next week. And that notion, incidentally, is a very modern notion in Christianity. And that is, the answer, of course, is formation of conscience. That as long as you make sure that that conversion is authentic and you educate people in the requirements of that conversion through formation and the development of a good conscience, you'll get the right result. But if you don't take that next step, if you don't form that conscience, the community is in jeopardy. And I'd like to leave you with one question. Look around our society today. We're essentially a society of rules. But we've got a lot of people in this society who think they can get away without following those rules. And where is that leaving society right now? I wonder how Paul today would react if he were to look at where we are today. So I'll see you next week for the last class, where we'll deal with two issues, the question of formation of conscience and the final exhortations in the letter to the Galatians. Thank you.